Good.
That's hilarious.
What's up?
You have, what do they call it? Not an entourage, but a fan club. Right. I'm surprised they would set a chair that close to the edge. Seems like a safety concern.
Don't worry, you'll probably. It's a hot mic. How close is it? Now I'm waiting for him to tumble offside.
Well, he moved over a little, so he's no longer on the
Smart
verge.
move. Sure. How was your trip down, Oscar?
It was good.
When did you
Came down early this morning.
Excellent.
Okay, we
So
get everybody
6:30
to
flight out
take
of
seats.
Norfolk.
Yes.
It's not too bad. Southwest is a straight shot. You can't beat it.
That's all right.
Yeah. And then I'm here for tonight and tomorrow morning. I head up to Jacksonville for a couple of days and then back to Norfolk.
So kind of as a,
Yeah, we got in last night because, coming from China.
Yeah.
thanks for coming. I
Early,
appreciate
but, stay
everybody's
tomorrow.
attendance right after lunch. I know there's a lot of options out there, and we appreciate you for coming. So we have a great panel today. It's the Sea Service flag general officers that have arrived and shown interest this week in ITSEC has been really impressive. I think set almost a record for the folks that are here representing really significant commands, and I'm personally very thankful. I know as we planned ITSEC this year, we had some pretty interesting spikes in COVID right in the middle of a decision period, sort of the August, early September timeframe. But we just said we're going to pray about it and make it happen. So there was no option. So last year we did this virtually, and it was okay, but it wasn't great, and it was painful. And I think everybody lost this ability to network and to actually communicate person to person. I know, very dissatisfying. So we've had a couple of events this year. One of them was in June where COVID rates were low before they started spiking. And we usually have 800, and we had 800 in person, plus we had 100 online, 200 online. So it was actually the highest attendance that we've ever had. And the attendance here this week is really very clearly on par with 2019, minus about 1,000 international folks that just couldn't travel or had, what's going on out there. So even the U.S. didn't really open up until the middle of November. So it was a challenge. But when you get the CNO and the CMC to show up at the same time, I mean, something's going right. And Admiral Meyer was out there this morning. So we are extremely pleased, and we're pleased to have such a robust set of folks on today's panel. And tomorrow we have another panel of distinguished general officers from the Marine Corps. So the ROE for today is we're going to start up. I'm going to introduce the panel, the entire panel, go through their bios a little bit, give you a little idea of who they are. Then we will go down the panel with opening remarks. So they're going to tell you what hurts their head and what they're into, what kind of messages they're proceeding on. So that'll go through the prorated, the regular portion of it, and then we're going to do question and answers from you all. So we have question cards. You should see them on the seats, and then you'll fill out one page of it, not two. And the ROE on those is they have to be polite, they have to be respectful, and they have to have a question embedded in them. And we will not be addressing, we're not going to do controversial or off the grid kind of stuff. And we really aren't going to dig down into any kind of singular programmatic, my program, this, why didn't you do that? So that you will find the filter man here will not allow, the wrong kind of question to get up here. So most of the questions today, and I had like 100 at the second panel, they were very good and really quality questions. So maybe I'll give them to you after you leave. You can connect with whoever it is. But today's panel is really terrific, and a lot of significant leaders in the communities. So the first person I'm going to introduce is Vice Admiral John Mustin, who's the Chief of Naval Reserve. He started, in his sea service assignments as a commissioning OPSO and the Donald Cook, and then combat information officer. Then he was navigator and air warfare commander of the Independence Battle Group. That's a pretty significant job there. Then he affiliated with the Naval Reserve in 2001. As commander of the Naval Reserve Force, he leads approximately 59,000 reserve component personnel who support the Navy, Marines, and the Joint Forces. He's got a whole history of going 1,000 places in support, and most of the reserve officers that I know, they've done one of every, two of some, and they're just incredibly helpful to us. When I was J5 and at CENTCOM, I had a reserve flag, 2-star there, and boy, he rode pretty hard. So we appreciate you being here. So help me welcome Vice Admiral Mustin.
Thanks.
Next, we have the Rear Admiral John Meyer, who's the commander of all Naval Air Forces Atlantic. So that's another hard job that we appreciate you give us our time. He's accumulated over 4,000 flight hours and 675 carrier landings. He took command in May of 2020, so he's got over a year under his belt. He was operationally assigned to electronic attack squadrons, Carrier Air Wing 2 and VAQ 128. He was the executive officer on USS Harry Truman, a carrier, and which won a slew of awards while he was there. Command tours include VAQ 136, another huge set of awards. Command of the USS Gunston Hall, and he was the commander of the pre-commissioning unit for the Gerald R. Ford, which had to be a tough job. That was a tough ship to get going, a tough ship, all this new technology in it, and it was a wonderful outcome. Commanded Carrier Strike Group 10 and the Naval Warfare Development Command. He's participated in operations around the world and is a true warrior. So please help me welcome Admiral Meyer. Next we have Rear Admiral Bill Dillon. He's the commander of Naval Air Warfare Center Weapons Division and the assistant commander for test and evaluation at the Naval Air Systems Command. So he was designated an aviator in 1994 and reported to VP1 in Barbers Point. That's got to be pretty tough. That's one of those fighter guy, Barbers Point guy. So it's pretty good duty. He went to U.S. Naval Test Pilot School, was a graduate there, Air Test and Evaluation Squadron 20, VX-20, which is, testing, which is good. Later deployed to Djibouti, which I've been to. I think it's one of the hottest places on Earth, and not a wonderful spot, actually. He's designated a Aerospace Engineering Duty Officer, ADO, in 2002, and served in a series of acquisition billets associated primarily with the P3, P8, a lot of the P3 derivative programs, and subsequently had a tour as a military assistant to the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition Technology. That's another tough place to live, and was vice commander for the Naval Air Systems Command. Previously commanded the Naval Safety Center, and he assumed his current position in last year. So please help me welcome Admiral Dillon. Okay. Next we have Rear Admiral Susan Brauer Joyner. She's a native of Savannah, Georgia, one of my wife's favorite places to go. And her most notable piece of her bios as she received her commissioning in Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute through the ROTC program, which is kind of where I started my life. It was only 25 years earlier, but she's got a whole bunch of master's degrees, computer science, postgraduate school, a lot of communications. She's deployed to the high north and the North Norwegian Seas, Mediterranean, Arabian Sea, the Western South Pacifics, Iraq, supporting Operation Enduring Freedom and Iraqi Freedom. And she's supported the fleet as warfare commander for, information warfare commander for Carrier Strike Group 8. And she was Assistant Chief of Staff N6 for the U.S. 7th Fleet. So please help me welcome Rear Admiral Joyner. Last but not least, for sure, we have Rear Admiral Bob Westendorf, the Chief of Naval Air Training. Another big job jar in there. He assumed command in 2020. He's accumulated more than 3,800 flight hours and 900 carrier landings, flying my favorite airplane, the F-14, as well as the F-18, which I have some time in. But there's a certain cadre, there's a certain bond of those Tomcat guys and gals. His operational assignments include Fighter Squadron 103, Strike Fighter Squadron 41. He commanded VFA 25, commanded Carrier Air Wing 11, which I was deputy CAG for at one time. He was executive assistant to the Deputy Director of Global Operations, U.S. Strategic Command. That's a joint job there, but you got to go get those tickets. And he was Chief of Staff for Maritime Operations Center, Director for Commander Naval Forces Central Command, which I've also participated in the U.S. 5th Fleet, Kingdom of Bahrain. As Chief of Staff for Commander Naval Air Force of San Diego before becoming Sinatra. So please help me welcome Admiral Westendorf. So with that, I'm going to sit down and turn it over to Vice Admiral Mustin.
All right. Well, thanks for the introduction, Jim. And I just want to echo my appreciation for the invitation. As I look around, particularly on this panel, and most of you wearing khaki in the audience, I realize that there may have been a mistake when you invited a surface warfare officer here. But that said, I couldn't be more excited to join you today. So I'm the Chief of the Navy Reserve, as you heard, and I would say it's probably helpful for me to establish a little context first to help you understand the perspectives that are shaping the decisions and the initiatives that we're developing in the Pentagon and as I get around to see the fleets. So first, the country has recognized the need to transition from what was the global war on terror to what is now referred to as an enduring strategic competition. So what does that mean for us in this uniform in particular? It means refocusing on maritime domain initiatives, and that can be under, on, above, or in cyberspace, or in space for that matter. But it means that we, as a Navy and a Navy Reserve, are likely to invest less in land-based, non-maritime conflict initiatives, and instead, in some cases, come back to our roots about dominance in the maritime domain. The second thing it means is we're at an inflection point, both in the Navy and again in the Navy Reserve, to define what the future looks like, to be ready not only for today, but for what might come into the next 5 to 20 to 50 years. So how that manifests itself now is significant analysis on what are the capabilities and the capacities necessary to maintain relevance, to deliver against what the nation demands for today, but also to be ready for what may happen in 2027, 2030, or 2050. And that's a non-trivial exercise. The budget implications are significant. We're still continuing to wrestle with what that looks like, given that we're within hours of a CR expiration, which likely results in a CR extension. So, you probably have heard or are familiar with the impacts on what CRs look like for us. But more importantly, it's forcing us to redefine our priorities. And in my case, as it relates now to this precious group of selected reservists and our full-time support, TAR talent, and some of our individual ready reserve folks, about 109,000 in total, it means we've got to be focused on readiness in those things that matter. So I'll be the first to tell you, over the last 20 years, we've gotten very good In fact, we are perfectly optimized for yesterday's conflict. We are less prepared and less designed and ready for what is likely to come into the future, which I would say is not going to manifest itself in a slow burn. And a couple of data points for you. Since our invention prior to World War I, so in 1915 when the Navy Reserve was invented, we have mobilized in advance of every conflict that the nation has participated in. Note that I said in advance of every conflict. Even for Desert Storm, we had a 6-month run-up where we said, mobilize the reserve force. What I can tell you right now is what we're seeing in the Crimean Peninsula, in the Straits of Taiwan, what we're seeing in and around the South China Sea, and the Arctic, and the Baltic, and the Red Sea, and its significant choke points around the world. If something is going to happen, our intel suggests that it will probably be very fast. And that means that I no longer have the luxury of saying, I will mobilize the force at a gentlemanly pace. Or I will mobilize the force in the absence of contested processes. So I know that our adversaries watch how we do business, and the one thing they're going to want to do is complicate the way that we deliver 50,000 sailors. You know, for the last 2 decades, we've said we'll mobilize about 2,500 sailors per year. And the way we're going to do it is we're going to send them all to Norfolk. And then we're going to issue them Kevlar, and then we're going to send them into desert training, and then we'll get them to their supported command, and whether that's OCONUS or INCONUS, we'll figure out how that works. Well, I can tell you right now that there aren't enough hotel rooms, there aren't enough flights, and there aren't enough rental cars to send 50,000 people to Norfolk. So we're addressing that with some evolved procedures. We refer to it as adaptive mobilization that will allow me to leverage now the full-time support talent around the country and our operational units like our SNAFR units and our NECC units, the Navy Expeditionary Combat Command, where I can use my full-time support talent to mobilize our sailors. Now, there is an incumbent readiness expectation on our sailors. That is, you will own your mobilization readiness, your dental readiness, your medical readiness, your GMTs, your PFAs. You got to make sure that you're current and ready to go. That is very different than warfighting readiness. So what we're going to talk about on this panel and on the floor here is partially how we improve the way that the reserve force tracks and generates mobilization readiness. But most interestingly to me is the way that we generate and deliver warfighting readiness. And what's the difference? So one is, if I say to Admiral Garvin, I'm going to mobilize you and you need to be ready to go, he'll say, great, I can go to the airport tomorrow and I have done what I need to mobilize. Okay, that's the minimum cost of entry. That, for CELRES, is what you get a paycheck for. More interestingly, though, when Pedro arrives on station, he needs to have a badge that works. He needs to know how to get into the building. He needs to be able to log into a machine, have a profile that is already ready. He needs to be certified in the watch station that the taxpayers are paying him to fulfill. We don't do that very well right now. We will, and it will take a little bit of time, and hopefully with the help of the members of this audience and some on the watch floor, we'll get more efficient and frankly deliver a better ROI on the taxpayer dollars that feed Title X that allow me to generate this ready force. So I won't belabor the point, but I would tell you that I have been tasked to transform the reserve, to shift from what we were good at yesterday to instead be good at those things that we must be prepared to do tomorrow. I feel a very rich sense of urgency every day that I wake up, not only because I turn into a pumpkin in about 3.5 years, but also because we don't have the luxury to sit on our hands and say what we did yesterday is going to work tomorrow. So my staff is bored from hearing me say it, but I say those who wake up hoping that tomorrow looks like yesterday are doomed to failure, and that won't be us. So with that, let me pass it over to my good friend Air Land over here, Admiral Meyer, and thanks very much. You bet.
Thank you.
Awesome. Well, Jim, thanks for the introduction. It's really good to be here. I've been wanting to come to this symposium for years, and this is my first opportunity. My job at Air Land is largely focused on current readiness or force generation of naval air forces. So if you look at aircraft carriers and aviation units on the East Coast, however, I do a lot of that current readiness and force generation for all of naval air forces in partnership or in complete alignment with the air boss. That is typically referred to as manning, training, and equipping. So how we send people, the personnel, the lifeblood of our Navy to our units, how we train them, and how we equip them. The manning piece, largely that is a process that comes from Navy Personnel Command, distributes people. We'll do some fine tuning on that, in particular, some particular skill sets, and I'm getting a little bit on the tactical side here, but how we balance those skill sets and how we implement a new way of measuring that, which is the aviation maintenance experience metric. Anybody who's flown an airplane or, quite frankly, been in any organization, you understand that if you have people that are in that type model series or work on that particular aircraft throughout their whole life, they get really, really good at it. If you take somebody that works on helicopters one tour and you send them to go be a chief petty officer or a shop supervisor in an F-18 community on their next tour, they generally don't do so well. So we know that, and we've implemented that, and that's improving the quality of our maintenance workforce. The training piece that we execute at Naval Air Forces, largely two areas. One is how we train individual aviators through, Gimp will talk about the Sinatra side of the production side of that, of how we generate a naval aviator. But then when they get out to the fleet, we have a whole training and readiness matrix with different events, evolutions, ordnance, different periodicities. It's a pretty well-honed process. There's a lot of room for improvement, though, and I've seen some amazing technology out there, because what we do is largely time or periodicity based, get the execution of the event done, and you are trained. And if you think about what's happening with Project Avenger and some of the other initiatives for how we train, and there's some amazing data out there that you can mine and really get proficiency-based training, not so much event-based training. So there's room that we have for improvement in there. And I would argue that that process of how you train an aviator from the day they walk in the door in Pensacola to the day they retire as a CAG or later, it's really got to be completely synchronized and aligned. And we're doing better in that area, but there's still room for improvement there. The equipment, and I'll come back to training in a second, because that's really where my largest interest is. But from the aviation side of training, I would tell you we're doing extremely well. I'm very happy with the glide slope that we're on. We're doing these things now called Inject Alive, where you can fly a section of F-18s, get synthetically generated targets to work your tactics and your training evolutions. You only have to fly 2 aircraft instead of 4, so it reduces cost. You can do things that you would not want to show to adversaries at ranges that you don't want to show adversaries. So we're really improving ourselves there. And then we're doing live virtual constructive work, where I saw an event not too long ago at Oceana that was, I would tell you, was about 90% of what we have been doing at Air Wing Fallon throughout our aviation careers. The only difference, there were simulators in Whidbey, simulators in Oceana, simulators in Lemoore, and in Fallon, all connected together, all being run with the same graphics and display. Wasn't as good in the debrief maybe as what we do in Fallon, because there's that synergy and camaraderie aspect. But I'm here to tell you it's light years ahead of where it was when I was a junior officer. So we're making good progress, and I will come back to training. On an equipment side, this is probably one of Naval Aviation's biggest success stories, and you may or may not have heard about this, but we've been on this process improvement, Navy Sustainment System Aviation, which is really leading the Navy in how to get after our readiness, in this case, the equipment, the material readiness of our aircraft. It wasn't too terribly long ago, about 3 years ago, that we only had about 220 fully mission-capable F-18s. Right now, our target is 360. Last year, we had 341, so we actually raised the bar. We've got a little work to do to get up to 360 this year, but every platform that we have in naval aviation is meeting our marks. F-18s are just a little bit short this morning. My point with that is we have never had better mission-capable rates in naval aviation than we have today. It's a true testimony to process improvement. Let me come back real quick, because I want to throw this out for this audience. In the area where I'm really fascinated right now, we recognize that the cost to operate our business, the cost to train and develop a carrier air wing, is pretty high. And the cost per flight hour is pretty staggering. The cost to maintain our aircraft is staggering. And one of the areas that I've got a laser dot on is how can we reduce some of that flying hours and increase more in the simulation side. And I think we have to do that. I'm not talking about taking a hatchet to that, but we've got to be able to shift a little bit of that more. And if you think about the delta and the cost per hour between those two and the high-end tactics that you can do in that, I mean, that makes perfect sense. And we've got to do that because we're looking at a flatline budget in the future. And if you look at the inflation numbers that we see, a flatline budget with the inflation growth that we're seeing in parts alone, we can't get there unless we do things creatively. The area where I think there's the most opportunity, though, is an area where Pete Garvin and I are working, and this is the training of our maintenance communities. I talked a little bit about recycling those skill sets. So if you train somebody to work on F-18 engines, no company in the world takes them and sends them somewhere else. That's stupid. When you spend that much time and energy to invest in that, and now we can do better there, and we will do better. But what we also can do better is how we measure and how we assess the touch time. So if I get I'll call it a 10-hour workday out of a sailor, right now our indications are that we only get about 2.5 hours of touch time per maintainer on an aircraft. That doesn't sound like a very good business model to me. And our training process is not as rapid and agile as it needs to be. It takes too long, and I'm really excited about Project Avenger. I know Gimp will get into that. What we're doing with naval aviators is probably the most innovative thing that I've seen in the training business in a long time. But there is amazing opportunity about how we, with great agility, take an issue that we determine or discover on the flight line. Perfect example is fiber optic maintenance. It's challenging. It's not like working on electric wires. If you break that coupling, you've got to go through special procedures. Otherwise, you're going to have all kinds of problems. Well, we're late to discover that. We've added on training to that, but wouldn't it be nice to do that proactively? So I think I've quacked enough, but I look forward to your questions.
Go ahead, thanks.
All right, I think I'm up. Yeah, I'm Scott Dillon. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm with you here from China Lake, and where I'm the commander of the Naval Air Warfare Center. Jim mentioned during his introduction my time in Djibouti, and declared that it was about the hottest place on the face of the earth. And that may, in fact, be true, but there are plenty of times where China Lake feels like it's a close second. However, if you are planning a trip out to China Lake, now would be as good a time as any to come out and visit us because the weather is about perfect, and there's a lot of great things to see that are going on out there. I thought I would just take a little bit of time to talk about some of the things that are happening out at China Lake, particularly with regard to innovation, training, simulation, some of the main themes of this conference here this week. To that end, I thought I would talk about some of the resources that we have in place out at China Lake and some of the partnerships and the relationships that are in place out at China Lake and also down at Point Mugu. The Naval Air Warfare Center is really two separate locations, one at Point Mugu, one at China Lake. They're separated by about a 3-hour drive, but it's a much shorter flight. So it's a very large facility. Some of you are probably quite familiar with it. Others of you may be less so. The China Lake Land Range alone is 1,800 square miles, which is significantly larger than the state of Rhode Island. The airspace that overlies the land range is 20,000 square miles of controlled airspace, and then we're really two separate facilities which work collectively with one another. The Sea Range, which is located at Point Mugu, is 36,000 miles of instrumented airspace, and we use these ranges in conjunction with the laboratory facilities, the engineering support facilities, the basic manufacturing and prototyping facilities that exist across this roughly 8,500 person organization in order to do a wide variety of different things that I think are applicable to the topics that we're discussing here today. One of the things that we do more so than anything else is provide a great deal of engineering support to various different programs of record. And that engineering support comes in a variety of different forms. But one of the things that is more important to a lot of programs these days, particularly as they're concerned about how they are going to ensure that the systems that they design are interoperable with one another, is some form of mission-level modeling and simulation. So we have, among other things, a facility that is referred to as the Integrated Fires Lab out at China Lake. And the Integrated Fires Lab is a mission-level simulation which uses actual operational flight programs from various different programs of record in order to better explore how these systems are going to interact with each other when you're at an early stage in the acquisition cycle. Now, the reason I think that's particularly relevant to some of the discussions that we're having in these forums this week is because these simulation tools, they're useful as developmental tools, but they're useful for multiple different purposes, and they provide us with a significant capability to support not just experimentation, but also to support training. So while we are primarily a test range, there are a significant number of customers who train on our ranges, and we are basically co-located as part of an area that we sometimes refer to as the Mojave area, the Mojave Range area, with a variety of other services and a variety of training facilities. We conduct our own simulations in support of sponsors who need to determine what the results of a tactics development effort geared toward more effective deployment of long-range fires might be. So some of the specific things we do in order to support those type of customers are to actually inject in a constructive manner a simulated integrated air defense system into the experiment that our sponsors are running. Other times we will record and replay live air tracks, all as part of a simulation that allows people to develop tactics and explore new concepts and develop new systems in a way that they might not be able to if they didn't have access to the sort of wide range of integrated resources that exists at a facility like NOC-WD. But because we have the ability to support that type of development, we also have the ability to go out to fleet units and support training that relies on the same sort of technology. One of many exercises that we've supported in the fleet recently was an East Coast exercise with a VFA squadron that's midway through the home cycle for a maintenance period. And at that particular point in the home cycle, the squadron would typically not have much of an opportunity to train in a particularly threat representative way. But we were out in October on the East Coast providing injection of virtual and constructive air contacts into a 12 sortie event, a training event that a particular VFA squadron conducted over a 2-day period. And we got a lot of great feedback that was it resulted in a more robust training environment than the squadron could typically accomplish at that point in the home cycle. So many of these capabilities really do have a dual purpose. And the thing that allows us to take full advantage of the dual purpose that many of these technologies have are the relationships that I mentioned at the start of my remarks. So not only are we located in a particularly beneficial area with regard to the amount of space that's available to conduct the type of exercises that I've mentioned, we're also very close to the Air Force. We're close to the Nevada Test and Training Range and the Utah Test and Training Range. We're just south of Fallon, and we're just north of the Army's Fort Irwin, the Army's National Training Center down at Fort Irwin, and we are also just north of Edwards Air Force Base. So because we're so close to all of these other potential partners, we have the opportunity to conduct exercises that involve them and to leverage the capabilities that they have, which we do not, and vice versa. We have EW capabilities on our South Range that are unavailable to the Army. The Army needs those sort of capabilities in order to provide more robust training at their National Training Center. But they're right across the fence from our South Range, and so they can make use of the capabilities that we have in place, and vice versa. There are plenty of Air Force capabilities that we don't have duplicates of at China Lake or at Point Mugu, but we can leverage the combined capability of all of these organizations because of the fact that we're relatively geographically co-located and we've been working to build up relationships with these organizations. In fact, the last thing I'll mention as far as those relationships are concerned is a recent exercise that took place at Point Mugu. Many of you have heard of Red Flag. Red Flag is essentially the Air Force's annual combat training exercise. It's one of the larger exercises that the Air Force puts on every year. For the last couple of years at Point Mugu, we have been hosting something that we have termed Gray Flag. And Gray Flag is more than just a training exercise. Gray Flag brings together developmental squadrons, operational test squadrons, and it brings together tactics development teams from Top Gun and from Fallon. And it also brings fleet units to the Sea Range down at Point Mugu so that we can accomplish multiple things simultaneously. It's essentially a 2-week exercise designed to explore the interoperability of different systems from each of those participants' perspectives. And the participants typically include nearly 30 different aircraft, 2 different services, Navy and Air Force. It includes surface units as well as aviation units. And each of the participants in the exercise has a slightly different focus, but because we are playing a large number of different systems against one another, using the resources that are available on the Sea Range, everybody takes something away from it, and they take something away from it in a way that's applicable, not just to tactics development, but to the training that subsequently follows. So I think there's a lot of opportunity when these sort of facilities exist and these sort of partnerships exist to build upon the original purpose for a Navy lab or for a test range, and to use these resources that are already available to us in new and different ways. And that, I think, is one of the important things that we need to be focused on, and one of the things that we're talking about at the conference this week. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Everybody looks awake still. I'm Susan Brauer, Joyner. Very happy to be here with you today. And I'm just going to start out with a little poll because I'm slightly different than the rest of the panel. And it's not just because I'm a woman. I'm an information warfare officer. And that means something in the Navy. How many folks in the audience are familiar with the information warfare community or information warfare generally speaking? Yay. Okay. So you're still going to hear my prepared remarks. But when we started out, right, it was a new concept. A lot of services didn't necessarily take the same approach that the Navy took. And what did we do? We looked at existing communities and we said, how do we better integrate our information capabilities to improve decision-making and increase the lethality of our warfighting? And that was the journey that 4 separate communities took: the information professionals, the intel community, the meteorologists, that's a hard word, and the cryptologist, right? So all of us have different aspects of expertise in different elements of information. You'll see some synergy when we start to talk about cyberspace operations. You will see some synergy when we start to talk about assured command and control, and you will see some synergy when we talk about battle space awareness. Those are the 3 areas that we really focused on. How do we improve our ability to fight? Why am I bringing this up? We are white-carded in almost every single live training exercise and certification event. We form the foundation of success in distributed maritime operations and strike group operations, and we are so critical to those operations that we cannot afford to disrupt them in order to avoid disrupting other warfighting training objectives. Well, that hampers us, and quite frankly, when we talk about training live, it hampers a lot of strike groups. I've been on strike groups, depending on how you count it, 3 different times. And my last time as information warfare commander, I had the distinct privilege of participating in 2 COM2Xs in a single tour. My level of learning by doing that was significantly greater. I didn't repeat all the same lessons learned that are the constant threat right? Every single training group, it's like, why is nobody reading the knowledge portal? We've had these lessons learned before. Well, that's not how we learn. We learn by doing. And how can we learn by doing in a way that respects a flat top line, that respects the ability, the urgency of not just learning the lesson right the first time, but maintaining our proficiency and maintaining our ability to practice in different scenarios. We do that through live virtual constructive, or in our case, in the information warfare community, virtual. We have got to be able to practice virtually, and when I talk about that and I talk about information warfare, the first place people go are, okay, we're going to do cyberspace operations, we're going to fight the network, and the defenders are going to defend the network. Guess what? I have communicators that don't know how to switch from satellite to satellite because we do it exactly once, maybe twice per deployment, and we hold our breaths till the last possible moment because we want to reduce the impact to the warfighter and their ability to do assured C2. Well, that may work when we have the luxury of time. It does not work when we have to switch agilely, quickly, and minimize disruption to communications. We have got to be able to practice it. But resources in the real world are at a premium. And so how do we practice communications, satellite communication shifts? We've got to be able to do it virtually. We talk about white carding and, let's say, intel. In almost every single exercise, intel is white carded because the systems at the high side and the systems where we're doing the exercise, they're not connected. When we look at meteorology and we look at the weather conditions in the exercise, are we actually simulating weather conditions? Usually not. Right? So how do we as a fighting force understand how we are going to fight in the worst conditions possible if we're not simulating them in an immersive environment? That's the vision of where we need to get. That's what we need to be able to do, not just on a once a deployment cycle. We have got to be able to do it whether we're sitting in the Arabian Gulf driving circles in the water, whether we're out in the South China Seas performing a freedom of navigation. These are perishable skills that we have got to be able to practice consistently, and it can't be the same drills. It's got to be scenario driven, so we're actually developing our critical thinking capability. To the greatest extent possible, it's got to be integrated because none of us are going to fight alone. Anti-service, subsurface, air, information, all of us have got to be able to figure out how to integrate our fires, our effects, in a way that gives the commander decision space. And we cannot do that in our silos. And as we talk about the training environments that we've developed, and it's all goodness, right? We each grew up in our own silos, and now we're trying to integrate them. And we hear about the money that goes into integration. There's a certain amount of physics that goes into it, how do systems talk to each other, but at the end of the day, a lot of it's data interoperability, right? How can industry help us by 4 simulated training environments, figuring out what those data standards are going to be? So now it's not a huge uphill battle to integrate the systems because we've got to be able to get there and we've got to be able to do it quickly. As we shift from your traditional hardware-based systems to our software-based systems, if we do not include data interoperability as part of that transition, we've probably missed something big. And so I would ask you to think about those things as we move forward. My passion in life throughout my whole career, if you look from my first job to my master's degree from Naval Postgraduate School to what I'm doing today, is cybersecurity. For those of you who have been around since 1991, cybersecurity back in those days was me as an ensign. This is what a virus is. This is what a Trojan is. Please don't do these things. 2021. This is what a virus is. We don't talk about Trojans and worms as much anymore. Please don't click any links, right? And so when you look at cybersecurity, a lot of it comes down to the basics, absolutely. But in this audience, what does it mean? It means figuring out how we secure our systems from day one. As the system's being developed, how are we designing them? How are we protecting not just the integrity of the system itself, but protecting the data that is resident in the system? If you listen to CNO and the Commandant this morning, and they shared these just eye-watering visions of being able to track at the individual level the training and experience somebody's had throughout their career and the proficiency and where their shortfalls are and what they're strong in and the results of their exercises. If I were an adversary, I would love that treasure trove of information, because guess what? You'll probably also have where they're assigned today. And if you're good at tracking those kinds of units, you're going to know who's headed your way and what their strengths and weaknesses are. If we're going to fully integrate the training systems and the operational systems to the level that we need to, security of the information and security of the systems becomes paramount to protect us against adversary exploitation. And they're going to be quiet. When you're collecting information, you don't need to be noisy. You just need to figure out the right place to park your sensors and start sucking up data, right? And when we think about training systems, I'll go back to the days of the internet, right? We created the internet. It was to exchange information, democratic process. We don't have to worry about protecting it. We're going to train people. It's a democratic system. We don't have to worry about protecting the data because it's not all that valuable. I'm here to tell you the data is valuable and we need to figure out how to protect it. And if we don't build the systems from day one in a secure manner, the cost to secure them on the back end is prohibitive. The folks in the audience who have tried to get a system through the authorization process and the certification process, you probably hate it. Guess what? I own it. I know what you're dealing with, and we're working to streamline, we are working to remove duplicative steps, we are working to remove the bureaucracy, because at the end of the day, it's about risk management. But I can't do effective risk management if the system did not take any basic cybersecurity hygiene into effect in its design and development. And so I need your help there. DoD put out the Zero Trust Framework. I think that's an excellent starting point. Quite frankly, when you look at a lot of the things that we talk about when we talk about zero trust, it's just a new way of talking about old concepts. Least privilege, authentication, to some extent segmentation, but in a logical as opposed to a physical approach, right? And so let's see if I've got all of the things that I said that I wanted to do. And so I'll get off my cybersecurity soapbox. It is my passion. I love it. And when we talk about integrating IW into the training environment, because it's so critical to what we do, the Navy has started making that investment. We've started in 2022, we will introduce IW capabilities into the Navy's continuous training environment. We're standing up a battle lab and fleet training units. You'll start seeing those come to fruition in the 22-23 timeframe. And we're working on the corollary to that, which is the IW certification exercise, to make sure that we understand how to operate together as a team in order to improve our warfighting lethality. And we anticipate piloting that in 2023. So we've had pockets of training excellence in the virtual environment. I am thrilled, again, to be here to learn so much from all of you as we move forward, but we look forward to increasing that partnership moving forward. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks. All right, I'm last here, and I'll try not to talk too long so that we do actually have time for questions here. But Rob Westendorf, Naval Aviation Training Command. I think many of you probably know what that entails, but for those of you that don't, undergraduate pilot and flight officer training for Navy, Marine Corps, Coast Guard, and select international partners. I also have some oversight responsibility of the Fleet Replacement Squadron curriculum, with the concept being from street to fleet, meaning when a student starts flight training to the time they check into their squadron, their actual fleet squadron, that it's a smooth and continuous training continuum with no gaps or overlaps. This is my first time at ITSEC, the first job that I've had, been in the job now about 18 months, that I've had the opportunity to come here. And it's been a very eye-opening experience walking the floor yesterday and today. But I get to live every day the product of former ITSECs, and I'll talk a little bit about our Naval Aviation Training Next initiatives. It's very easy to talk about the technological aspects of Naval Aviation Training Next. Today, we are training students with our low-cost virtual reality trainers, our mixed reality trainers, but the Naval Aviation Training Next initiative has many other pillars that was addressed this morning by the CNO and the Commandant. The whole concept hinges around the ability to produce a higher competent aviator that we send off to the fleet. Those warfighters that we need to send off to fight the next war, not the previous war. The global war on terrorism was a unique skill set for naval aviation. I think we were very good at it. We're very good at it today, but it doesn't translate well in many aspects to this near-peer threat that we have to deal with in the future. So those aviators that we send off to the fleet, as they learn their tactics, their techniques, and their procedures in a near-peer threat environment, we need to up the game, and that's the genesis of Naval Aviation Training Next. Again, the concepts were not mine. Those were my predecessors, and we partnered with the United States Air Force in their Pilot Training Next initiatives. I have a very close relationship with General Wills as we determine what the best avenue is to train the next generation of naval aviators and Air Force pilots. So I'm going to give a little bit of overview of where we stand today, Naval Aviation Training Next, and if you have any other questions, I'll be happy to answer them at the end. But as Admiral Meyer said, it started off with what we call Project Avenger. Project Avenger was the first initiative in primary flight training in the T6. And the concept, again, was to introduce new technology, but really it was to transform the old mindset of how we train an aviator. Again, the concepts that were discussed this morning. We provide an environment where students that have either prior aviation experience or just have that natural aptitude to learn quickly the stick and rudder skills, the concepts, we allow them a syllabus where they can advance through that syllabus at their pace. And I can give some examples later, but we have had students that have blazed through primary flight training in weeks. It also provides some avenues for those aviators that are not quick learners. Now, we're always going to have a standard. We're going to have a maximum time to train. But a most recent example in the most recent graduating class of Project Avengers, we had an aviator, a little bit of a slow learner, absolutely brilliant in the mind, understood the concepts, but just the physical stick and rudder skills was just a little bit below average. Well, in the traditional syllabus, if you don't master the first skill set, say your familiarization flight, you don't advance to the next stage of training. Well, in Project Avenger, you do. And so this case, it's a well thought out, does this student have the potential and the ability to succeed? And we determined he did. So they did not achieve safe for solo, but we didn't delay them. We put them in the instrument phase. We allowed them that extra time in the simulator and in the backseat of the aircraft under the hood to attain those stick and rudder skills. When they were confident that he had met that, he went back, did the safe for solo check, did a solo flight, and actually graduated, weeks later successfully from the syllabus. So we allowed an opportunity for an aviator that may have attrited from the program the ability to finish. And again, we will track all the metrics on these students to ensure that we are getting the product to the fleet that we need to the fleet. Again, it's all about, in my mind, producing a higher competency aviator. to win that next conflict. But there are some other side benefits that certainly the Pentagon gets very excited about. I can reduce the time to train, and we've already proven that. The second Project Avenger class that graduated, the average time to complete was about 20% less than the actual legacy syllabus time to train. And as we all know, less time spent in the training command is more time spent in the fleet learning that higher level craft. So we're succeeding in that. And I think we can save a few dollars as well, which the cost pillar in NSS is very, very, very important, so that we have the money to train, to buy the equipment that we need to equip our force to win in combat. So again, I'm not going to delay too much more on naval aviation training next, other than to say I have two other. Project Avenger is, again, primary flight training. Project Hellcat, which the first class kicks off next Monday, December 6th. That is an intermediate syllabus for those student aviators that have selected the strike pipeline. So the concept is they fly the T6 primary, they select strike aviation, and before they go to the T45 intermediate and advanced syllabus, we give them a top-off in the T6, about 10 flights or so, where they start to learn some of the advanced, well, it's really basic concepts in strike fighter maneuvering, so think more formation and some more dynamic maneuvering. And so I can give them about 10 hours in a T6, which is less than a quarter of the cost per flight hour of a T45. Then the next step is what we call Project Corsair, and that is applying the Naval Aviation Training Next methodology to the strike fighter syllabus or the T45 syllabus. That first class will kick off early next year. Right now it's targeted for early February. So by the end, the Corsair syllabus will take about 42 weeks. So about a year from now, I will have the first students that have gone through Project Avenger, Project Hellcat, and then Project Corsair. And we'll track their performance. We'll track their performance in the fleet through data analytics. And right now, all indications are that I'm really past the proof of concept phase for Project Avenger, and I have the data that is successful. In about a year and a half, we'll have the data of the entire system from start to finish to ensure that we're on the right track, and we are, in fact, sending that higher competency aviator to the fleet. So I'm happy to answer any of your questions. Thank you.
All right, thanks a lot for your comments. So we've got a good bunch of questions. I'm impressed. And they all follow the rules, and that's unusual. So it's good to go. So we've got a lot of information warfare cards here, which is interesting. I think information warfare has a tough job selling both the impact positively and the negative impact, that could happen, and that's why we never want to inject real information warfare into real exercises, because they shut them down and then you can't do the live training gets sacrificed. But we appreciate the fact that it is important. We also see that one of the frustrations we talked about before we came was from the developers, the fact that they can make systems fairly quickly, but it takes an awful long time to get them certified, encryption, all the different three-letter guys that got to go through the system and make sure that it's okay. So do you have any recommendations on, and when you talk about how to build that into the system, about how industry could go about that? I mean, what do we need to do to get the product already qualified before it, as it shows up, to be a product to be bought?
Wow. So there are many levels to that question, and I have to be cognizant also that that sometimes that costs extra money. And so let me just start by saying one answer does not fit all. There are some systems that are standalone that probably need less security than other systems that are highly interconnected. And that's one of the things that, as we are looking at reforming our risk management framework process, to take that into account. So that would be the first point, is to truly have the discussion with your proposed customer of how connected does the system need to be. Then the next question that you should consider is what type of information is going to be on the system. And there are guides out there about impact level 1 through 6. There might be a 7 and 8. I haven't studied that much yet. But impact level 5 is controlled but unclassified. That includes most of our PII information, much of our HIPAA information with some additional protections that are necessary, and that's where you start talking about the physiology of a person and tracking it by person. So you need to be cognizant of the type of information that is going to be stored, and then to look at what DoD says are the necessary protection levels. And then finally, I would say look at how you're going to sustain the system. Too often we build systems in a, I won't say fire and forget, but kind of a frozen state. And if you have a highly interconnected system where the hardware and the software are so tightly linked that you cannot update one without updating the other, or without significant intrusive interactions, then you've probably designed it in a way that is not going to be easy to sustain from a cybersecurity perspective. When I look at our current technology and the ability, even if it's not in the cloud, but to take those cloud concepts of developing in layers, infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, software as a service, the more you can abstract each level, by the time you get to the certification of the software piece, it is so much simpler. And so have that discussion with your customers of, do you have an environment that is ready to accept an application? If you do, what are the interfaces? What are the APIs? What are the tools I should be using? Because DevSecOps is the way of the future in the Navy to agilely develop and deploy in a quickly accreditable way solutions. So those would be the primary principles that I would offer you should start with. And then maybe before you start building, as you get into the testing, pull the Information Systems Security Manager into the discussion instead of waiting until after everything's built. It's really that dialogue has to start from system design, and the sooner you can get that security discussion started, the sooner, the quicker you're going to be able to get your system authorized.
Okay, thank you. I think one of the things that we saw here at ITSEC, and this is 6-7 years worth of work, was the complaint that industry was building things and it took a long time to get certified. They could build it in 6 months and it would take 3 years to actually go through the process. So I think that one of the things that we did with the NOC TSD and the Team Orlando kind of group was to do an integration drill on the show floor for 4 years, and then NOC TSD decided to turn it into a permanent lab. It's an integration lab that is designed to get sort of an government operating kind of environment, and then industry go in there with candidate systems and see if it works, and sort of self-certify. So anything we can do to reduce that 3-year gap between the product, being brought to really an operational status and the potential availability of that to, and we find a lot of commercial activity, where the banking system is doing a lot of the same kinds of things. They want secure data, obviously, that there's some lessons learned out there that are somewhat, we would think revolutionary, because they have multi-level security on the chip. They do, I mean, they're probably 6 or 7 years ahead of us. So do you see any chance that DoD would go out and try to find a commercial aid to to solving this, rather than see how they do it? I'm sure you've done this.
So, interestingly, we have an OTA on the street right now, and I need to make sure I say these things in the right order. We've got two different things going on. We've got an OTA on the street right now to look at how industry would do continuous monitoring. Because if you can do continuous monitoring and meet the minimum controls that we are in the process of defining, then that certainly simplifies, it lowers the barriers. And designing tools with that continuous monitoring capability embedded, or leveraging an enterprise version of that, would certainly not only get you over the hump sooner, but ongoing authorization, so you don't have to do it every 3 years. Carrot, anybody? So there's that, and then we also have another, I forget the name of another one of the shortened contracts to say, and here are the tools that we will use to automate the process, so it's not as highly manual and it's not focused on artifacts that are in a specific format that have to, I want the continuous data feeds. I don't want a scan every 3 years. I want to see what the system is doing today. So I am, anytime I hear multi-level security and I hear it on a same physical device, I get very nervous, because adversaries will find the hole. And so when you look at DoD definitions for IL-6 and IL-5 and such, there are physical separations in place, because we are not comfortable today with our ability to protect the multi-levels of security on single physical infrastructures.
Okay, well, challenge to the industry, we need to go faster. This is critical to the whole community, not only from the training side, but the operational side, that we've got to find some technologies that'll overcome this. I know there's been many efforts to do multi-level security, to try to drive it into a more palatable solution, but we just obviously aren't there yet. So, but it's, to me, the technology is turning so fast, and this 3-year cycle to get something turned around, and it's just not really acceptable. So we're stuck between the risk and the benefit of this, and so that's why we love cybersecurity, but we hate it. I mean,
So as an example, a containerized application working on the Cane's Agile Core Services, we were able to get authorized in under a month.
really, okay, perfect.
And so again, moving away from hardware-based things into the software realm gives us the capability, assuming all the criteria are met, of accelerating. And our goal is to get it, even less than a month. But
Okay, that's great. So let me ask Vice Admiral Mustin. I said, you've got a whole new sort of strategy about competitive great power. I mean, we've gone from, A to Z in terms of the mission set that we're trying to promote or train around. So how are the reserves? Are you changing your missions, or how are you keeping up with that shift? I mean, because in some ways, I feel like we're returning not to yesterday, but possibly back to the Cold War, where we did fleet air defense, and we did, I mean, because that would be, the scenario, I think, essentially.
Yeah.
So what are your changes in organization and/or how would you go forward and try to be the leading edge of that
Great.
return?
So great question. And first, just want to take a moment to thank you also for the coveted 1400 post-lunch time period. I'm looking out here, watching as the interest wanes. But all right, let's liven this back up because it's about to get good. So I sent out what was about my 100-day new guy mission analysis, and I sent it out to the Reserve Force under the title of the Navy Reserve Fighting Instructions. And I said, here's what I see. And I articulated some of that early, which was, again, we're perfect if yesterday is a proxy for tomorrow. And I know that's not the case. I mean, as we read what's coming out of the National Defense Strategy of 2018, and we've got some folks in the room who have fingerprints on what is likely to be the new National Defense Strategy. So new administration, I think we'll see, it's either December or January, so this month or next month, we'll see the National Security Strategy. Quickly on the heels, we'll see the National Defense Strategy, the new version under Secretary Austin. And there's likely to be a lot of similarity from the documents that are on the street right now. And what that means is, what was 4+1? If you're tracking from a few years ago, anybody know what the 4 was? It was China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and violent extremism. Okay, and then we said, well, it's not really 4+1, but now it's 2+3. And guys like Oscar and I were like, it's still 5, right? And it's still the same 5. Okay, but now maybe the emphasis is China and Russia. Without getting too far ahead of my skis, I would say we're likely to see that it's really kind of China as the pacing threat and everybody else, although there were certainly capabilities within the Russian enterprise that are of interest to us. So, you'll see in these new documents that really what we're saying now is it's not GWAT. Okay, it is enduring competition. And we're not even talking about necessarily the kinetics and the conflict piece. We recognize that in the future environment, we're going to get along with these major players, and it's in our best interest economically, diplomatically, certainly militarily, not to seek conflict, in fact, to avoid it. I mean, this is Sun Tzu stuff, right? Thousands of years of collective experience have led us to say it's better for us not to fight. But if we fight, we better win. And so now back to what I'm doing with the Reserve Force, there's a recognition that we're going to train to be ready in hopes that we never employ the awesome lethality that we're building now. But if called upon to do so, we need to be ready to move. So now back to the specifics of the question, the fighting instruction said, we're bucketing 3 lines of effort together that describe this transformation. I call it design the force, train the force, and mobilize the force. And the first update to the fighting instructions will come out in a couple of months, and I'm adding a 4th line, which is really the people piece. That's going to be develop the force. And so, the first part, this first year, we've been looking at auditing and assessing the relative value of the totality of the force, broken down by units and competencies, in some cases by SysCom or TICOM contribution, certainly by the 4-star fleets, Navier, Fleet Forces, and PAC Fleet, and then I say they're my primary customers. If I can give them what they need to fight, then we're not far from wrong. If we go down one echelon to echelon 3, now we're looking at the numbered fleets and the type commanders and the SysComs. And they are significant customers for me as well. And I interact with them frequently to say, what do you need from the Reserve Force? More interestingly, are there things that we're doing for you now that you don't value? Because I don't have an infinite top line, and I'll tell you right now, our top line is not likely to grow. So what I want to do is maximize the value of every person that I have today. And that has resulted in year 1, I'm on month 15 of my tenure, in the reduction in about 500 units. In some cases, we're consolidating units, where I may have 8 units of 20. I'd rather have 2 units of 80. And that's purely an efficiency motivation, which is to say every unit that I've got in the Reserve Force has a CO, an XO, a senior leader, a PFA coordinator, a urinalysis coordinator, a training officer, an N1, et cetera. So by aggregating, I actually grow flexibility, and I reduce administrative overhead and bureaucracy. So through some consolidation, the negative feedback was, hey, you're removing command opportunities. And I said, well, no, what I'm doing is introducing competition. So you will compete to command, It is not a God-given right, and unfortunately, what I saw was, through analysis, we had about 1,500 units, and they ranged in size from 750 people to 3. And I had 500 units that were 10 people or fewer. And some of those units were commanded by 06s. And I said, we're just not going to do that anymore. So now what I'm trying to do is create a proper pyramid wherein the ratio of 05 command opportunities to 05s in inventory is more favorable than 06, meaning you compete to win and lead as an 05, at which point you may or may not be selected to be an 06. And yesterday, if you were an 06 and could fog a mirror, you got command. And so, unfortunately, now I have reduced dramatically the number of 06 commands to say 06 commands should be substantial, consequential, and large scale. And you should build on your experiences and learnings as an 04 or 05 skipper and then lead at a large level, which then helps when it comes time to start talking about 07s and 08s, obviously. But that's part of the force design piece. Not only to consolidate and improve the efficiency on what we've got, but to identify the gaps in what we're not doing that the fleet commanders want. For instance, space. So when I talk to our information warfare commander, SNIFR, we call the Chief of the Navy Information Forces Reserve, dotted line to the IBOS, Kelly Oshbach. I work very closely with her to define what we're delivering with our 8,000 information forces sailors. But we looked at how are we translating space capability to shooter. And so what the numbered fleet commanders told me was, in our maritime operations centers, I need space capability. But to grow that in our active component is complicated and slow. And I said, I can be your skunk works and I can move faster because I'm both an Echelon deputy CNO, as a strategic advisor to the CNO, but I'm also the commander of the reserve force at Echelon 2. So I built 6, it doesn't sound significant, but 6 space billets per numbered fleet last year to the tune of 60, so that now we're testing the training pipelines required to grow the VS3, VS5, VS7, et cetera, capabilities so that we can translate what we know is the capability that resides in space down to the shooter level, at least at the Maritime Ops Center level at the numbered fleets. We also looked at cyber. I have said my cyber capability is a growth industry. There's no question that is something where we look at our NIOX and our JRICS and what we're doing in Buckley and what we're doing in Peterson Air Force Base, or Space Base. We're going to grow there because that's what the fleet commanders are asking for. In some cases, there are things that we did that we no longer value or don't value as much. And I want to be really careful by saying there is no reserve sailor that showed up for work and said, today I want to waste the taxpayers' dollars. Okay. What we have said, though, is I view this as portfolio analysis. And I've got some sailors that were making 8%. And that's great if you look at historical returns from the Great Depression to today. But I need all of our sailors to make 40%. So in some cases, I'm divesting capability that was returning us to the 8%. What does that look like? Well, I get heat when I publicly disclose this, but there's a couple of, I'll just say, there are some units that we have done away with, and we have reinvested or harvested those precious billets in new areas to standardize maritime operations centers across the fleet to the tune of about 500 billets across the reserve force. That gives Admiral Paparo, Admiral Grady, soon to be Admiral Caudle, and Admiral Burke a standard template for maritime ops center readiness so that, one, I have a training continuum where my 04s we can invest in them in their training, and then they can walk in the door, whether it is at Navier or 6th Fleet, or Fleet Forces or 2nd Fleet or 4th Fleet, or Pac Fleet at 3rd Fleet and 7th Fleet, and they have a continuum. They can do work as an 04, as an 05, as an 06. And that one early investment is a permeable skill set that has value across the force. So as we look at what are we getting rid of? We're getting rid of some things that don't score well, and it's not just a subjective opinion of John Mustin. It's based on the Fleet Integrated Priority List and the CNO's POM guidance. They've expressed what their priorities are. And as a simple guy would do, I said, hey, I have an idea. Let's create a 2x2 matrix. And those axes are the CNO's guidance and the Fleet Integrated Priority List. And let's map out all of our reserve force. And we'll use large dots for lots of people and small dots for little people. And if they reside low left like any consultant would tell you, they're at risk. And if they are upper right, that tells me that they are valued by the CNO and OPNAV and the fleets, and that's good. What is upper right, though? In some cases, they're not areas where the reserve force resides. It's Columbia, nuclear deterrent forces, strategic forces. So I don't have a lot of that. I do have a couple of NICTAMS units. I was shocked to find that I was like, wow, this comms unit, actually they score off the charts, upper right. Small unit, I should make them huge. But the reality was we have a lot of things that are, a lot of sailors that are doing great work. They're just not doing work that matters when it comes to China and Russia. And so when I look at, for instance, our USS Constitution unit that loves to dress up in period costume and do reenlistments and retirement ceremonies, that adds value to the Navy's oldest commissioned warship. I just don't think that China or Russia give a damn about it. And I've said that if the Chinese invade Taiwan, I'm not going to mobilize a bunch of sailors to the Constitution. So that means that I can use them or employ them better in other areas, and that is the force design element. Now the training piece, and I won't belabor this, I'm taking more than my share. The training piece now is what's interesting here. How do I train sailors to walk in the door ready to contribute, whether it's a mock or at space or somewhere else? I look at the mode piece, we described a little bit of changing the process wherein we mobilize 50,000 people in 30 days, which is the commitment that I've made to the CNO. Again, not 2,500 per year. You know, I went down to see the folks in Norfolk and said, you all are doing a phenomenal job. You're doing what the nation has asked of you. The only problem I've got is I need to do 15 times your throughput in 1/12 the pace. So we know that we can do this. It takes some procedural change. It takes some training change. It takes some organizational change. We have to put some people where they may not be comfortable today, but train them to be ready. But when I look at designing and training and mobilizing the force, that's how I get ready for what comes tomorrow. So
Great.
anyway.
Well, thank you for that.
Sure.
So Admiral Meyer, I got a couple of questions for you. One of them is, what do you think the limits of LVC are in terms of fleet training, preparing folks to deploy? As a guy who used to do 2% simulators and, going to a simulator was like not a fun thing, but I think a lot of that's changed. So now what do you see the vision to be there?
I think it's a really insightful question. I don't know that I have an empirical answer. I'll tell you that my gut on that is that if I look at the current balance of flights to simulation today, and it's heavily skewed in flights for most aircraft, that's a little different for the P8 community. They were built with much more simulation baked into their TNR matrix from the outset, and that's more of a characteristic of a new type model series aircraft. F-35 is the same way. That's great, except that doesn't work on deployment. And that is where the absolute bulk of our flying is, and the bulk, therefore the bulk of our cost is in terms of naval aviation. I would tell you that if we could, set a maximum of probably 25% would probably be the maximum. I'd be happy to move the needle one flight, quite frankly, though. If we could take away one flight and say, in all TMS, that flight, we're no longer flying that flight, and decrement that number and move that over into a simulation event, that'd be a step in the right direction. And I think we could measure that empirically with cost savings. Obviously, there's some outlie for the simulators. They're not free. There's a lot of upfront cost with them, and we use contracting to run those simulators. That's probably the start of that, I think, in my mind. And there's other aspects to that, though, too, and that ultimately gets into the concept of how you train when you're at sea, and if you can improve that simulation at sea, the LVC piece, which we're putting on our aircraft carriers now, which is done through Link 16, which gives us an ability to inject live aircrafts. We're cutting into the overhead flights. So realistically, I want, and I'll just talk about the fighter community briefly. I want our fighter pilots focusing on blue tactics. And right now, the state of weapons and the pacing threat of the Chinese in terms of range and capabilities really puts us in a position where we have to employ exquisite tactics almost perfectly. And we can measure to that, and we do measure to that. We've got some great data from an air wing that went through Fallon. This was really kind of an eye-opener for naval aviation. We sent an air wing through Fallon, 4 strike fighter squadrons there. One of the metrics, it's a very simple metric, there are probably better metrics, but it's kill ratio. How many folks did I kill? How many times did we die? Pretty simple metric, and we've got data on that that goes way back. We're developing much more detailed metrics, actually, because when you think about what it takes to improve your kill ratio, well, you got to kill better, and you got to survive better, in simple terms, right? So if you're better at the weapons employment, you move that lever up. There's a few subcategories to that. If you're better at defending yourself in terms of how you employ countermeasures, how you maneuver the aircraft, and you survive better and you move both of those, guess what? Now you get a pretty significant step function in kill ratio. Well, what we found in this was it was VFA 111 or VFA 11, and they had a 2.5 times greater kill ratio than anybody else that went through Fallon. That's pretty significant. And what we found in that, pure and simple, the commanding officer and the training officer, the leadership that they had for how they trained to fight and win, really focused on utilizing the simulators to the maximum extent possible. And when I say simulators, it wasn't, old school simulators like, hey, you got a sim on Friday, go, knock out a couple of approaches and, make sure you log that. That's not really what we're talking about. We're talking about a high-end training event, high-end tactics overseen by a training officer, and that squadron simply from leadership that focused on fighting tonight, improving their lethality, made a huge step function in that. That's somewhat a cultural issue, but we're also trying to inculcate that now as well. So.
Yeah, because I know at Fallon, they've had to go into the big warehouse there with simulators to do real-world stuff. I think that also the LVC question has an impact on what does the adversary fleet look like, and how much do you want to, where do you want to spend your resources on, and there's a pretty good battle there, I think, in terms of cost and effectiveness.
Yeah, there's that constant battle that we have of current readiness versus future readiness, right? And current readiness is expensive. It's the manning, the training, equipping, the flight hours that I have to employ, sending an air wing to Fallon, lots and lots of reps and sets. So to get that where you want it to be is very expensive. And perhaps the opportunity to maybe take a little risk on current readiness so I could invest money on new platforms. My fear is that we don't have that luxury today. To Admiral Mustin's comments about, the next fight, I don't think we're going to have 6 months of indications and warning. I think they're going to fire the flare, and we're going to fight tonight with what we got, where we got it.
Wow. Well, I think that's really true, and I think the Commandant made that comment several times. So we didn't get to a lot of these, but a lot of interest on my end for the Sinatra programs for pilot training. I think, my life in pilot training is the time to train was 4 years, 2 years, 1 year, 5 years. And it's just getting that right, I think, is essentially great. I also look at the Avenger-like event, which is a philosophical thing where we used to flunk people out, a trite, excuse me, at a certain point because of a certain value. So I think there's great utility to the small-scale simulators to allow folks that don't do well on the first pass to go back and mitigate that. Maybe third pass, fifth pass, spend their weekends doing it. And especially true as we see the need to go down and find the diverse, get into the diverse populations that may not have grown up in a say an aviation world, or they're not really sure, they don't have the I can do it, believe thing. And I think that all the services are headed in, I've heard CNO and CMC talk about, we've got to go broaden the force, make it look like America, and even the airlines, when we have these big airline phone calls, they're all looking for talent, and a lot of it's in those zones that need a little extra help. So it's, when you talk about zero attrition, that's pretty good ROI, especially if they're the right people. I mean, there's some that are just not for it, but we encourage, I congratulate you all for the quick spin and how that all, I'm on the phone calls, where they're all reporting on their progress, and it's really exceptional. It's only been going on like 3 years, and it's had a great effect. And we're always interested in finding out what NOC AD's doing, to make some new thing that's going to change the world. And the next panel, we'll get to that. But I thank you all for being here. I think this is a great panel, a great group. A little bit after lunch crowd here, but at least you knew how to write, so that's great. And I want you to help me thank our panel. Okay, tune in tomorrow where we're going to have a panel in the morning with the Marine Corps. And so they're going to have a lot to say. Thank you.
Right. Thanks, Jim. All right. Appreciate that. Are you going to? I was going to say, hey, great.